Here we are.
Here we are.
It begins.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Caldwell, what a privilege
Oh.
to be here today to hear your story. Because many of our patrons know the story of the festival, but there was no festival until you had the idea for it. So it's the journey that led to that idea, and then how that idea became a reality that we get to talk about today. So let's begin at the beginning.
Okay.
So you grew up in Benton, Arkansas.
I was born there. My father moved us back and forth from Benton, Arkansas to East Texas. So I lived about half of my childhood in East Texas and the other half in Benton.
And what was it like in the Caldwell household growing up? What was your childhood like?
Well, it was a big family. I mean, there were 7 children, and my father was a sawmill worker. My mother was a housewife. And although there were 7 children, there were never 7 at home at the same time because my oldest sister is 26 years older than my youngest sister.
And you fall where?
I'm 5th of 7.
Okay.
And the timing was such that I sort of grew up alone because the child just above me was a girl and 5 years older. And the child just below me was a boy, but 8 years younger. So I didn't have many playmates. With my parents, it was different between the two of them. My parents were not educated. They went through 8th grade. Although my mother later on finished her GED and took some college courses and,
Really?
and wrote some stories that were published. My father only had an 8th grade education, and he spent his life just trying to make a living for the family. In fact, my mother used to say her wedding bells rang in the Great Depression, which is pretty accurate. They were married September the 1st, 1929, and the stock market crashed in October.
Wow.
So the first 10 or 12 years of their marriage was pretty rough.
Yeah.
But I worked from the time I was in the 8th grade.
What was your first job?
Packing groceries at a grocery store in Marshall, Texas. And then the next year, when I was in 9th grade, I was only 14 years old. I can't believe they did this. I was made the assistant manager of a snack shop that didn't close until 2:30 in the morning.
Wow.
And so after school, I would go to work at that place by myself. I was a short order cook. I was the cashier. I did the counting up at the end of the evening, the locking up, and I was 14. They couldn't do that today, but I did.
What were you like as a student?
School was my refuge. I hated to hear the bell ring in the afternoons to go home. And that was true all through my public schooling. I never really wanted to go home from school. I loved school so much.
Yeah.
All the things you do in elementary school, being introduced to music. In Marshall at that time, they even had an elementary orchestra. And we had music lessons every day and art lessons, and those were things I didn't get at home. When I was in 1st grade in Marshall, one of the daily activities, and I'm sure most people my age will remember this, was the teacher would hand out a mimeographed page with a drawing on it, and you were to color it. I always envied the kids that had a 32 or 64 count box of Crayolas because I only had either 8 or 16.
Yeah.
But one day, she handed us an elephant. That was a drawing of an elephant, mimeographed, of course. And whereas in the past we had had colorful things at different holidays to do, this was an elephant. I remember so well thinking, what? An elephant is gray or brown or whatever. How boring is this? And the whole page was taken up with this elephant. I started to ask her if I could have something else, and then I realized that wouldn't be a wise idea.
Yeah.
So I looked around, and everybody else was pulling out their gray and brown Crayolas. So I pulled out the gray Crayola too, and suddenly decided this just won't work. So I started making polka dots, and I colored like pea-size dots all over the elephant that were gray. And that was not interesting enough. So I took pink and blue and I filled in between them with pink and blue dots. So it was a polka dotted elephant. And I was pleased with it. I thought, now that's a different kind of elephant and a much more interesting one. She took them all up, of course, and didn't say anything. But a few days later, there was evening when all of the parents were invited to come to the school, meet the teacher, and check on their progress. And my parents came, although I was surprised my father did come. And she had framed my polka-dotted elephant and put it on the bulletin board behind her desk,
Yeah.
which made me very proud. And I was reveling in the teacher's praise and recognition. But on the way home, my father said, "What's wrong, boy? Don't you know elephants are all gray?" So that was sort of a symbolic incident of my relationship with my father. Not critical or not, certainly not abusive in any way. He worked very hard to put food on the table. We just never saw eye to eye. He often commented on how strange I was or how funny. He used the word funny boy.
Do you think that one of your draws to the theater was that escape into a world that's larger than life, a world that
Absolutely.
isn't practical, that
Yeah.
although sometimes you're portraying realism on stage, it is not reality.
No.
It is something much greater.
Much greater, yeah. Yes, my father was very smart, although uneducated. He was very good at math, and he was a millwright in addition to being a sawmill worker. And he designed how the machinery and the conveyor belts would be constructed and the ratios of movement and that sort of thing. He could do that without any formal training. But he was very practical because at the age of 17, he was married already. And I think had he been able to live his ideal life, he would have gone on to college. He would have become an engineer of some kind. And he certainly was capable of that. But because he was so busy and so tired most of the time, my relationship was mostly with my mother because I was at home with her before I started to school. And she paid some attention to me, but he seldom did. When I first went off to college, I was the first person on both sides of my family to go to college. So that was a strange experience for everyone, including me. And he was very proud. He told everybody that his son was in college. But then when I decided to major in theater, he stopped telling anybody that he had a child in college because he knew they would ask what I was majoring in. And my father was extremely strict and no nonsense. He thought dancing and any kind of entertainment was just tomfoolery and foolishness, bordering on immoral, I think. So we eventually established a surface relationship, but it was after I dropped out of college. After my sophomore year, I dropped out. And he and Mom bought a little grocery store, neighborhood grocery store that was also a gas station. And he called me. I'd run away from home, and I was living in Marshall. They were in Benton still. And he wanted me to come home and help my mother run the store because I had experience doing that sort of thing for several years when I was in high school. And I told him no. Eventually, I did go when my mother asked me to. And during that year, because I was home helping her and therefore helping him because he was still working, we shared more in common. But before that, the one reason I left home was we had a big, not fist fight, but a big fight, a big disagreement that was very unpleasant. Maybe the most unpleasant thing I've been through. So, yes, at the very end, and then he got sick, and he died at the age of 60. So for that very brief time, we were speaking to each other regularly.
So backing up a little bit, a good student,
Yes.
Was it through school that you became interested in theater, that you first learned about theater? What was it? When did that draw, that interest begin?
Well, that's an easy point to reference. When I was in the second grade, we lived in a small town just outside Beaumont, Texas, because there was a sawmill there. And we didn't own a television. I'd never seen a television. We had a radio. I'd never been to a movie because my father disapproved of that. And I'd never seen a play, of course.
Yeah.
So one day the teacher announced that a touring company from either Chicago or New York, I don't remember, was coming to our school to perform Rumpelstiltskin, a children's story I was familiar with, because we had a book at home, one of few books, that was fairy tales and children's stories, and my older sister would hold me on her lap and read those to me in the evenings, and so I knew most of them by heart. So I thought, well, what is this? I'm going to see Rumpelstiltskin? It was a whole new idea to me, but it cost 25 cents, and I did not have 25 cents. It cost $1 every week to give your teacher for lunch, school lunch. So I decided to go, even though I dared not tell my parents. So I paid her for 4 days, 80 cents, and held on to the other 20 and thought I would find a way before the performance came about to, gather up the other nickel.
Yeah.
And by pure luck, I found a nickel on the schoolyard. But instead of turning it in, as I felt I should have done, I gave it to her and bought a ticket to see Rumpelstiltskin. And the day came, and we went to the auditorium, which was the only permanent building on the campus. And we marched in, and I'd never been inside an auditorium either. Not like that one. That actually had a stage on it. And I was in great awe. It was like a sanctuary or like a church or something I could imagine. And I wondered what was behind those curtains. And when they parted, I saw what I thought was really the inside of a castle, stone castle, with a spinning wheel sitting in the middle and all of that stuff. And I was absolutely awestruck because I thought it was real. I had no reason not to think it was real. And then Rumpelstiltskin came crawling through the window, and he looked exactly like the picture in my storybook. And my heart was just out of control. And I sat absolutely stone still, listening to every word. And I believed I was watching this character. And the story, of course, I knew by heart, but it was exactly as I remembered it. The costumes were fantastic, the lighting, the sound. I was scared. I was worried about the fact that in my heart I was rooting for Rumpelstiltskin rather than the other people. I liked him. I liked how mean he was and how mischievous he was. And at the end, when the princess has to guess his name, when she did guess it, some of the students were shouting out his name for her to hear, and I thought that was terrible. But I spelled it with her when she spelled it out. And then he flew into a rage, horrifying, and went running and jumped out the window of the tower, and I heard him fall to his death. And I don't know how it happened, but instead of getting in line to walk back to this classroom, as I intended to do, the next thing I remember, I was tearing through the curtains on the stage. I ran up on the stage and went through the curtains and ran over to the window where Rumpelstiltskin had jumped to his death. And as I grabbed hold of the window facing or whatever, I was shocked that it wasn't stone. It was cloth that was painted. And I looked through the window and there was just the floor. And that was even more bewildering than the play I had seen. I just couldn't make sense of it. So I went around the side, backstage, and I saw all the walls were cloth and were just stretched over wooden framing, and they were held up by metal stage braces. I don't know how to explain where my mind went.
Yeah.
But just as I was trying to figure it out, this girl came toward me from backstage, and she was dressed in Rumpelstiltskin's costume, and she had long hair, her cap was gone, and she was pulling her nose off, literally tearing it off. And that was shocking. And she said, "Hello, young man, may I help you?" And I thought, that's a girl. And that's a fake nose. And I was speechless.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something, but I was horrified, really, really in shock. And by the time I could muster up the courage to say something at all, my teacher grabbed me by the collar at the back of my shirt and swatted me on the behind and said, "You're in trouble, young man, now." And she jerked me off the stage and marched me back to the classroom. But it was no use. My mind was gone. And I remember thinking almost exactly these words, because I couldn't pay attention to anything else that day.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, what was that? How do people do that? That's what I want to do. I want to be able to fool people just like that.
So then, were there, in the schools that you attended, were you able to be involved in theater?
No.
Were you able to explore it at all in the classroom? When was it that sort of the next opening came for you with theater or literature?
I think the germ that sprouted into interest in theater was poems, stories, storytelling and poetry, the use of language to create a different world. My sister read me those stories. I memorized many of them and many of the poems from beginning to end. Second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth grades, teachers took me around to all the classrooms to recite these poems that they somehow discovered I memorized, long poems, and sing, because I did that a lot.
Yeah.
So I was sort of performing solo from time to time and loved it. But in seventh grade, and we moved back to Benton, there was nothing to do. So I decided I would audition or try out for cheerleader. There was another guy in the ninth grade who was a cheerleader. So I thought, well, that's performing of some kind. I liked the synchronized movement. I liked memorizing the lines. I liked the costume. I thought this would be fun. I did, much to my father's dismay, but I did it. And so in seventh grade, I was able to perform, at least in some manner.
Yeah.
And all the while, I was making very good grades in all the English-related courses, particularly. And then we moved back to Marshall. And luckily in Marshall at that time, and still to this day, because of the University of Texas UIL one-act play contest, you could perform or participate in a one-act play at the junior high level. It doesn't advance. You don't go to state, but you just have a district meet. And I was able to take speech instead of English for one semester of my eighth grade, and the woman who taught the speech was also the one who directed the one-act play, and she asked me to audition, and I did, and I got a role in that little 5-character one-act play. I was the only eighth grader to get a role, and that was another big turning point, because I realized through the rehearsal process and watching and listening to her and reading the scripts, I'd never read a script before. So this is where theater comes from. This is how it's done. And I was hooked. So the ninth grade, we were still there. I auditioned again and got the lead male role and won a Best Actor award, which I treasured. And then we moved again back to Benton. And at Benton, Arkansas High School, there was no theater at all. You couldn't take speech until you were a senior, and you couldn't be in the senior play, until you were a senior. So for 2 years, I thought, I got to find something to do. So I tried out for cheerleader again, did that during my junior year. And whereas I had enjoyed the 7th grade experience, I did not enjoy the 11th grade experience. There's just a stigma, and it's an unpleasant stigma of men or guys, boys being cheerleaders at that time, and still is to some degree, except in colleges today. So I didn't try out again the next year. Instead, I took speech and auditioned for the senior play and got a nice role in that. So that's how I was able to get through high school, biding my time for college.
Was Was Shakespeare introduced to you?
Yeah, yeah, in ninth
school?
grade. Yeah, that's another huge story that we don't have time for. After the 7th grade and my being a cheerleader that year, my father moved us back to Texas, to Marshall once again. And the first day of school, I didn't know anyone. It was a much bigger school, and I was nervous. We had a full school assembly, so my class happened to sit up in the balcony, and we gathered there that morning for opening school ceremony, whatever they call that. And down on the stage were about 6 or 7 people, the principal, the superintendent. The principal was a woman. There was the guy who was the student body president. The football coach, of course, was there. And they each got up and made their little whatever. But one little woman was sitting down there that sat sort of hunched over. She had really thick glasses, and she kept looking out at the audience, grinning, and every now and then she'd wave at somebody, and I thought, who's that strange little lady? She wasn't very beautiful, and her hair was a mess, and her clothes didn't fit, but she was acting sort of like a child. Well, her time came, and the principal got up and said, now I'd like to introduce you to someone who needs no introduction. She's a legend here. Her name is Miss Marguerite Jones. Well, the whole auditorium just sprang into applause and cheering. And she got up and kind of marched up there to the podium, but it was too tall for her. She couldn't see over it, so she just pushed it aside and stood to the side of the podium, and she looked out over the audience like this and put her hand up to shield her face from the lights. And they were still cheering, and when they calmed down, she pointed her finger like this, and she said, "Some people don't believe in fairies." Well, they just applauded and broke into hysterics again, and I was so puzzled. I found out her name was Marguerite Jones, that she was a 9th grade English teacher, and she was indeed a legend. Many people thought she was crazy. I learned after being there a few days that to get into her class in 9th grade, you had to make A's in your 8th grade English class, so I was determined to do that and did. In 9th grade, I couldn't wait to get to 3rd period up in the upstairs, and when we got there were about 24 of us, I suppose, the door was closed, and there was a sign that said, "Please wait here until later." And so we mumbled and whispered about what's going on, and then the door opened with some kind of grand gesture, and there was Miss Jones ushering us in, and she said, "Come right in, welcome, welcome. I've been waiting to meet you all my life. Now go find your seats." And she meant that because she had scattered the seats everywhere and put name tags on them, and we had to go find where we were going to sit. And that became a daily routine. Every day was somewhere else. And she told us the very first day, as she put on a smock that had a strap around her neck, tied around the back, and had 2 big pockets on the front. And the first day of class, she introduced herself, found out what we wanted ourselves to be called, and then she said, "Now, I have a good friend. I don't know how old he is, but he's over 300 years old. And he lives in the cloakroom." There was a door behind her desk that had a padlock on it. "Don't ever go in the cloakroom. I don't ever want to see you trying to get in the cloakroom. Is that understood?" And we, yes. But that day she said, "My friend lives there, but he stays out here when he feels like it, and he rests in my pocket." And she reached down into her smock pocket and held her hand out like a table, and she said, "This is my friend Puck, and he will help you when you don't know the answers, and sometimes he'll have some questions. And he sometimes sits on the pencil sharpener, but today he's going to sit over here on this book." She put him on the desk. Well, all of us, we're 14 years old, mind you, were having questions. But it was fascinating nonetheless because she was so sincere. And it turned out that soon we all began to believe that Puck was there. And then in the spring, one day, there was another sign on the door saying, "Please wait here until further notice." And when the tardy bell rang, she opened the door once again with a grand sweep and gesture, and she was dressed in a white Grecian robe with a wreath of flowers on her head and some gold sandals that had been well worn. And in the middle of the room, she had put a green piece of carpet, at least the size of this, and the chairs were lined up around the three walls facing the center. We had to find our seats. And it was a moment, a dramatic moment. She told us today we were going in the cloakroom. And sure enough, the lock was off the door. So she took each one of us one by one as she called our names. We went into the cloakroom. She closed the door so it was dark in there. And then she flipped on the light. And it was full of costumes and props from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And on the end of the wall, there was a big framed poster. And it was of Puck sitting up in a tree, the branches of a tree, looking very mischievous down on two Grecian lovers who were sleeping under the tree. And along the bottom it said, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." And she had explained to us that that's where Puck came from Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And today we were going to start reading it, but not just reading it. We would take roles, and the stage would be that green piece of carpet, and each of us would be given a costume or costume pieces and props. And that's how we were going to study the play for several weeks. She closed the door and it was dark, and she flipped on the light, and I saw what I just described to you. And she reached up and got a bag like she did for every kid, a shopping bag, and some slippers that were at the bottom, and a hat that was on the top. And she whispered, "Raymond, I'd like for you to read Puck." Well, I was just transported, what a compliment. And then as I was leaving the room, she pointed to the poster and she said, "Look, I think he's smiling at you." And indeed he was. The next few weeks we read Midsummer Night's Dream very carefully, one scene at a time, with her explaining everything, introducing all the characters. And it was magic to me, magic. I never read a play by anybody since then that was so exciting. She was one of a kind. And I credit her with not only my interest in becoming a teacher, but my interest in Shakespeare. There was something always, since I started school, that made me admire teachers. For one thing, my parents, as I said, did not get a full education. And so they were in awe of teachers, and they made us be very respectful of teachers. So that profession was up on a pedestal for me, always. In fact, when I first went off to college, because I was afraid to major in theater, not knowing what the future would be, I decided to major in elementary education. And I thought I would like to be a teacher. I knew it didn't pay well. It never has. But I didn't care. I wanted the interpersonal relationship with them. So that's how I knew. And but then I soon got involved in the drama program. And
right, because you left school, you left college for a while. So you were studying to be a teacher, majoring in education?
Only for one semester. And then I decided the theater is much more interesting to me, and I began to do a lot of plays, and I was the only employee at the student employee, did all the built the sets and hung the lights and everything, and acted in the plays, and it burned me out. But at the end of my sophomore year, a group from New York, or California actually, came through campus performing plays. They were a touring company. And they came through our college, and during the daytime, they performed a couple of one-act plays that all of us had to go, because I went to a private school where you had to go to chapel or assembly twice a week. And I loved what they did. And since they didn't have another gig to go to the next day, they stayed all night on campus in campus guest housing. And they came to see a performance of the play I was in, and in which I played a Hungarian poet dancer. And the following morning, which was on a Saturday, the phone rang in the hallway. I was still asleep in the dorm, and someone called me and said, "You have a phone call." So I went to answer it, and it was my theater teacher, who became a surrogate father to me, more of a father to me in most ways than my own dad. So he said, "Can you come down here to my office right now?" And I said, "Oh, okay," and I did. And when I walked into his office, there was this guy who had been one of the actors and the tour manager of that company that was still on campus. So Mr. Holt, my teacher, introduced me to him, and I said, hi, I enjoyed the performance. And he said, well, that's why we're here. We came to see your show last night, and we really liked it. And I'm here to ask if you would like to join our company. I certainly wasn't expecting that. And he began to talk about it, and he said, you'll see all 50 states in 1 year. We travel the entire country, including Alaska and Hawaii. You won't get paid very much, just your expenses, but you'll be performing constantly for a year. And the reason I'm looking for someone now, this was like late April, is that in the other unit, there are 2 units. It was called the Bishop's Company, and they were written up in Ripley's Believe It or Not as having traveled more miles than any touring company in the country. He said, in the other unit, there's a young man your age who has just given us notice that he's dropping out. He's breaking his contract, and he's going to be leaving in about a month. And that's the position I think you would fit perfectly. But you would have to leave soon and go to Berkeley, California, and learn all the lines for all the shows, or many, many shows they did, and then catch up with that company and before the month is over. I was just, what? A professional theater job, and I'm a sophomore, and isn't this what I always dreamed of? I mean, this is incredible. So I went running back to the dorm, and I called my parents, and they both got on the phone. And I'm sure, talking 90 miles an hour, just dancing around about what had just happened. And there was just dead silence on the other end of the line. And my mother started crying, and my father said in his inimitable way, "Are you crazy? Isn't the school just about to get out? Yeah. Aren't you on federal loans to go to school?" Because I had to borrow all the money to go to school and work in the summers. Yes. "And if you stop going to classes, don't you have to start paying those loans back?" I said, "I'm sure not doing it." So it was like ice water, just, wow. What a sudden come down. But I knew he was right. Of course, he was right. He was always right. And Mother was crying, as Mother always did if she needed to get her way with something. So I called back to the theater and told my teacher, I can't do that. I'd be dropping out of school, and at that time you couldn't drop out without getting an F. It became Fs then, and you couldn't earn it back. So I couldn't go. And I learned that the person had dropped out of the other unit. The guy that I was going to be replacing was named Samuel Rogers, who is better known as Sam Shepard, a famous playwright. Mm-hmm. I think about that a lot. Over the years, I've thought about it a lot. I don't know that I've ever wished I had done it. I just wondered what would have happened if I had done it.
Yeah. So then the fact that got, that blow, that pushed you then back into education, or you took some time away and then went back?
I'm embarrassed to say I became very depressed, suicidal. Started missing classes, started feeling sorry for myself. I remember one particular night walking down to the Washita River, which was a big river, deep and dark, and walking onto one of those old trestle bridges in the depth of my depression, and climbing up on that trestle, metal trestle. I really thought that I would just jump off, because I didn't know who I was, how I would get to where I wanted to be. I didn't want to finish school and have to pay off those loans. I didn't want to have to be a teacher then in order to avoid paying half the loan back, which was the deal. I just was totally lost. So I didn't go back to school the next year, and I went home, and I was angry with my father for no logical reason. He was right, but I didn't know it at the time, and I was very selfish. So when I got home after the end of school, I was not nice to him, and he was not nice to me. And I said, well, I'm not going back to school next year. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm just not going back. There's no purpose. There's no reason. We'll have to start paying those loans back. And I said, maybe, maybe not. And I worked out a way where they postponed my having to start paying the loans back for a year. And I stayed home. Well, I intended to stay home that year. But at the beginning of the summer, I refused to go back to my summer job with my father, which was working at a sawmill. I was working in the planer mill, loading lumber onto trucks. I didn't think I was too good for it. I'd done it for 2 summers. It wasn't that. It's just that it was related to my father and what he wanted me to do. And for the first time in my life, I had been stubborn. And so I was sitting around the house, and he got up as usual in the morning, 5:30 or whatever, and he said, well, come on, boy, we better go get you a pair of gloves, because you had to wear leather gloves to handle lumber all day. And I said, no, I'm not going. He said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm not going. I'm not going back to work at the sawmill. Well, that was incredible to him. What do you mean? Where are you going to work? I said, I don't know yet. I'm just not going back there. And he got really angry. So that evening, he must have let that boil inside him all day. And when he got home, I was still there, and he hit the ceiling. And he said, you're not going to sit around here all summer, I'll tell you that much. You're going to get some kind of work, and you better do it fast. And you're not going to use your mother's money. Mother was an Avon salesman. And he said, you're not going to use her money in my car to drive all over Little Rock trying to find a job. You better go buy you a pair of gloves, boy. And when I said, no, he said, you're ashamed of me, aren't you? That's what it is. You're ashamed of me. You're ashamed of me and what I do. You always have been. And for the first time in my life, I spoke back to him this way. I said, I'm no more ashamed of you than you are of me. And then he couldn't speak and had left the room, but I could tell he was crying. So that year was a time to regroup, and I decided I would go back to school.
Yeah.
But I changed my major from, just out of protection, I think. I changed it from theater to French. And so as it turned out, I had 3 majors. I graduated with 3 different majors and was qualified to teach in all of those areas. And by the time I was a senior, I had decided, yes, I will teach after all.
Yeah.
So in that second semester of my senior year, I went through all of those education courses, student teaching, and it takes up your whole semester. What a waste of time. But I did it, and never used a single idea in any of those classes in teaching, but it's how I got started teaching. And then I applied at Kilgore and got that job.
And then it's in this time that you met Anna.
At college.
At college.
Yeah. The year I dropped out, she came to college as a freshman, so I didn't meet her until her sophomore year when I went back. And she was working in the theater program, offstage, backstage doing work, and she was dating my roommate. So I got to know her, and we hung around casually. After rehearsals, we'd go for coffee and that sort of thing. Then I graduated and left and came here to Kilgore High School to teach for 3 years. And then I went to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school, I got a letter from her saying that she had moved back to California and was looking for a job. So we got together. I told her to come out. She did. I set up some interviews for her to apply for jobs in East Texas. She got a job. We married. We never had a date. Never, no. She came and stayed with me, and we married that very summer, and then moved to to Kilgore, and I started this job.
So how long did you teach at the high school?
3 years.
3 years there. And then what brought you from the high school to Kilgore College?
Well, the third year I taught over there, I wrote a one-act play that went to state in the one-act play contest, and that's the first time, and as far as I know, the only time Kilgore has ever done that, before or since. But one of my students was Joe Watson, who was the son of Dr. Watson, the president of Kilgore College, and he was very active in theater and poetry interpretation, that sort of thing. And his mother, Mrs. Watson, was a very active, supportive parent in thespians and all. So they were pretty aware of everything I was doing. Mm-hmm. He was in my classes. And one day during that third year I was teaching, he stopped by my desk on the way to his seat and whispered to me, "My dad wants you to call him when you have a chance." So when the class was over, I went to my office and called his father, who was much like a LBJ character. He said, "I want you to come over to my office as soon as you can." So I went that afternoon. And he was propped up in his office over there across the street, which was brand new at the time. And he just got right to the point. In fact, that's what he said. "Let's just get right to the point. Would you like to have a job over here?" And I said, "Sir?" And he said, "Would you like to be the head of the theater program?" And I said, "Oh, well, first of all, I think you have one." He said, "No, I fired him." And I said, "Well, second of all, I don't have a single hour toward my master's degree, not one." "I know that." He said, "I know all about you. My wife and my son have told me everything about you. I know all that. I got a plan. You got to find a place to get a master's degree, and you can't go to SFA. And you can't go to East Texas State University," which was called, yeah, that's what it was called then. I said, "Really?" He said, "No, we got too many teachers with degrees from those two. So you can go anywhere else, but you can't go there. Not if we're paying you." And they were paying me. So I made an appointment at North Texas and interviewed with those people. And right then and there, Dr. Holland, who was the head of the program then, mapped out a whole program for me to get a master's degree in 2 summers and then the thesis. So I started to school that summer. The first 2 years here at Kilgore College were killers.
Because you were by yourself, the only faculty member.
The only theater faculty, and this building was brand new.
Yeah.
And I knew nothing about it. The college I'd gone to, the theater was a renovated barn, and there were 6 lights that hung from wooden rafters. I got to this place, it was state of the art. And at that time, the plans were used by many other colleges for their new theaters, including UT. I was lost. And when I walked into this building, the man who had preceded me had taken everything down. All the drapes, all the lights, everything was stored away. And I didn't even know where to begin to put them. So I was very scared. And I taught every single theater class. I taught 33 hours of theater. And I directed 4 shows a year. I was never at home. And my wife got pregnant. She had morning sickness for 4 months in a row. At one point I said, "Anna, if you'll tell me what you want for breakfast, I'll go pour it in the toilet." She didn't think it was very funny. So it was killing me. I was never home.
Yeah.
So I took my letter of resignation over to Dr. Watson. And he said, "What's that?" I said, "That's my letter of resignation. I'm going to leave." And he was not happy. "Boy, we paid for you to get your degree." I said, I know. I'm very grateful." "Well, what are you leaving for?" I said, "Because it's killing me. This is at least a 2-man job. And I can't do it anymore. I'll die." Being a little dramatic there. Besides, I've already got another job. So we left, going back to Ouachita, and it took me another year to finish the thesis. But 6 years there teaching. I was an associate professor, got tenure. Didn't feel at home there, even though it was my alma mater. Once again, the fundamentalistic religiousness, the parochial complacency, I might call it, of that type of school at that time was anathema to the freedom you need to do theater the way it needs to be done. So I applied for a sabbatical, and I was given the sabbatical after my 6th year there to be gone for a year. I enrolled and was accepted at Indiana University. I was going to work on a PhD. Anna quit her job. We were pulling Brent out of school. He had just started first grade. We were going to leave in the summer and go to Indiana. And two things happened. First, Dr. Watson called me on the phone, and he said, "Are you leaving up there?" And I said, "No, I'm going to graduate school." He said, "Oh." So that's why that letter came across my desk wanting a recommendation, a reference. And I said, "Yeah." "Oh, well, shoot. I thought you were maybe leaving there. I thought maybe you might want to come back down here." I said, "I see." Well, he said, "Now tell me once again, why did you leave here?" And I said, "Dr. Watson, I left because you wouldn't hire a second person." And he said, "Well, we hired 2 people to replace you, and they'd been here those 6 years, and I fired both of them," he said. "So would you come talk to me?" And I said, "Well, I'm planning to go work on my doctorate, but yeah, I'll come talk to you." And that very week, I got a call from the dean at Ouachita. And the dean said, "I am so sorry to tell you this. You know, we can only afford to have 1 person on sabbatical every year." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, someone with more seniority than you has now applied since you did. So we're going to have to retract and not give you the sabbatical and give it to this other person." You know, so I just wrote my letter of resignation to them. I took it over there, and he said, "Is that what I think it is?" And I said, "Well, if you think it's a letter of resignation, you're right. I'm leaving. I already have another job," and I decided I would come back here. So I did, and that was 76, and I've been here ever since.
Oh. So you come back to Kilgore College in 76.
Right.
The festival doesn't start until 86.
Right.
So in that 10-year period, where did the idea to start a Shakespeare festival at Kilgore College begin?
I had no idea of starting a Shakespeare festival at all, but I became very interested in voice and diction, not just enunciation and phonetics, but the holistic part of voice, where it comes from and how your emotions affect it. And I began reading books, and one of them was Kristen Linklater's Freeing the Natural Voice, which I thought was an intriguing title. So when I discovered she offered a summer workshop in Massachusetts that you paid to go to, called the Summer Intensive at Shakespeare and Company, I began to think about trying to attend that. Not because of the Shakespeare part, because of the voice part. And I was curious about the psychological connection. And in 1980, I went to Lenox, Massachusetts to spend the month of June studying voice with Kristen Linklater, Tina Packer, and Dennis Krausnick, who were the founders of Shakespeare and Company. It was relatively new at that time. But because they used, the vehicle they used for teaching everything was Shakespeare. You had to go there with a Shakespeare monologue having already been memorized. So that was odd that that's how it started, but I went there because of the voice training and I wanted to know more about that. I had no idea what I was getting into. Anyway, I got there. One of the oldest people there was one woman who was in her 50s, but I was in my 30s. The rest of them were pretty much graduate students. And they put us in groups of 6 and went to the first class. We were locked in a room with no chairs, sat on the floor, told to take our shoes off. And Rocco Sisto, who was my group leader, one of Linklater's proteges, started in. He said, "Who's first?" And I was being a little afraid, and I thought, why not go first and get this over with? So I got up and did my monologue, and that began a month long of excruciating pain, because it was not what I thought. It was not correcting your pronunciation. It was not questioning your line readings. It was not delving into script analysis. It was, who do you think you are? Let's get to your soul, why not? Let's find out all your secrets. Let's break you down. And they did. I tried to leave after a few days. I thought, oh, I can't do this. I didn't know I was going in to be tortured. I was physically tortured. I mean, blisters on both feet because you had to dance in a gymnasium floor barefoot for an hour at a time without stopping. I was sore all over from all the exercises. My mind was rattled. I couldn't seem to do anything right. But I didn't go to class one day. I just thought, I'm going to pack my things and leave. This is inhumane and not what I bargained for. And then Tina Packer came to my room and was very human and understanding. She was a real person, and she understood. They knew what they were doing, of course, and they knew that some people would react the way I did. But she talked me through it that day, sitting on the side of my bed, and said, you know, you're going to be a different person when you leave here if you'll just stick it out. Mm. And I did, and I was.
Yeah.
And it was because of that, going there for voice, but working toward that goal through Shakespeare every day for hours. We worked 12 hours a day. That I began to understand not only Shakespeare, but theater. And I was embarrassed. I'd taught school for so long. I taught theater for so long, and it suddenly dawned on me, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I don't know anything. I got to start all over, and I got to start in here. And at 37, that's sort of a shock. Mm. So I came back, and it was very hard to readjust being home again after being through that kind of brainwashing for a month. But I finally did, but it changed the way I taught all my classes. It changed the way I related with students. It changed the way I related with myself. And even my son and my wife said, you're not the same. You're a different person. I don't know that they meant that as a compliment. I don't know that it was a compliment, that I was any better, but I was certainly different. That was in 1980. And in 86, 85, I hadn't directed a Shakespeare play. I didn't have the courage. But in 85, a lady in town whose daughter I had taught at the high school, and she was in the play that we took to state that I'd written, called me and she said, Raymond, what is Kilgore College planning to do next summer to help celebrate the Texas Sesquicentennial? I didn't even know what a Texas Sesquicentennial was. I said, I don't know. She said, well, I know what you should do. Have you read a book called The Last Boom? And I said, no. Well, it's about the discovery of the East Texas oil field in 1930 in the middle of the Depression. It's stranger than fiction, but it's all true. I want you to write a play based on that book and have your kids do it next summer. But I didn't have time or the talent to write the play, so I contacted a friend of mine who was a published playwright who worked at University of Texas at El Paso, and I said what I just told you, and I said, would you be interested in looking at this book? And he said, yes, so I mailed it to him, and he immediately called me and said, wow, yes, I'll write a play on that. This is exciting stuff. So little by little, scene by scene, he would mail me, we didn't have email at the time, scenes, and it became the Daisy Bradford 3. Meanwhile, I had been talking with the administrators here, saying, what if we did this next summer as our contribution? And he said, fine, what would it cost? And I said, it'll cost $20,000. And he said, fine, but let's do it for 2 years. But, okay. So I came back and I started making an actual budget, hoping I was close to right. And during that time, I was the fine arts division director at that time, so I had to work 12 months a year, which meant I was in that office by myself for 3 months. There were no classes. So during my work day, I would work on that, getting ready for 1986 and the Daisy Bradford 3, and I thought, Joe Cantu, who was my former student, who now teaches at SMU, was once in the Virginia Shakespeare Festival. He went to Kristen Linklater workshop with me. What if I added a Shakespeare play to either end of the Daisy Bradford 3, a local history play nobody knows? I might be able to interest graduate students to come here in the summer to do the acting, and I'll have a better quality production than if I use Kilgore College students who are too young, really, to do their best with Shakespeare, I thought. And I went back to the president and said, what if I do 2 Shakespeare plays and the Daisy Bradford 3? He said, fine, what will it cost? And I said, $40,000. Made it up again. He said, go for it. So I did. First year, we had the auditions. We did Twelfth Night, Midsummer Night's Dream, Daisy Bradford 3, but not in repertory. Most of my actors were graduate students at SMU, and a few were not, but most of them were. And we sold out every single seat for every single production. And so he was wise in saying, try it for 2 years, because the next year we did 2 different Shakespeare plays, but the Daisy Bradford 3 again, because there was real demand, filled the houses again, every seat. We did the Daisy Bradford 3 for 7 consecutive years, and it always had full houses.
Yeah.
At that time, this was 35 years ago, some of the characters portrayed in the play were actually in the audience.
Sure.
They were children when the play was in the play, but they were old people now. And it was a very special time.
So 1986 is the first year of the festival, and when does John Dodd start working with TSF, and then how has his job evolved over the years?
John Dodd is worthy of a documentary in himself. He was a student here for 2 years when I first came back to Kilgore, a theater student. And he was quiet, very thin, with a lot of hair, very quiet. And one day, I know I'm going off the subject here perhaps, but one day I was locking up the building, getting ready to go home, and I heard a noise somewhere in the building. It was late in the afternoon, maybe 6. So I followed the noise downstairs, and as I went down into the basement where the dressing rooms are, I noticed the dressing room doors were open, and they were mopped, and all the chairs were upside down on the counter, and the windows and the mirrors were all clean. And I still heard the noise, so I went past the second dressing room and I found John back there in the basement with a great big mop, mopping the floor. And I said, what are you doing? I mean, he was a student on scholarship, but scholarships don't include being a janitor. And he said, mopping the floor. And I said, well, I see that. Why are you mopping the floor? And he said, because it's dirty. And that's sort of the key to John Dodd.
Yeah.
So when I started the festival in 1986, I knew I would need somebody to help me.
Right.
And that image of John and the impression he made on me as a student who would work for nothing without being asked or told to was still in my mind. So he's the first person I called. He was living in Houston, and I said, would you like to come work with me on this new thing? And unfortunately, he couldn't because he was working with the Shaw Festival in Houston at that time. But he did come up during the summer to visit. And as he walked around looking at what was happening and all the people who were here from out of town, he said, what's going on here? And I said, well, this is what I was trying to get you to come help me with. And he quit his job in Houston, moved back and lived with his parents. And the second year of the festival, he came over every single day and worked half a day for free. He was working at night at a restaurant, but he worked for free at least half a day every day. And we didn't know what we were doing. We were sort of making it up as we went along, but I called him company manager. And he was so devoted, so constantly dedicated to it. So he came to work part-time, which meant he worked almost all the time for half salary during the third year of the festival, which is 88. And the next year I got them to hire him full-time, and he came on as the company manager. He stayed company manager for many years, doing not only the things in the job description that I wrote, but everything else. So I had him change his title to managing director, which gave him a bit of a raise.
Yeah.
More in keeping with all the work he does.
Yeah.
He is not one to ask for praise or even take it graciously. So he's always in the background, but he's the cog in the wheels underneath the workings of the festival. But in 2006, I petitioned Bill Holda, who was the president, because the festival had grown so. I asked if I could please be full-time festival without a cut in pay, so I could devote more time to that and not be shortchanging my students, because I knew I was shortchanging them. And bless his heart, he agreed to do that. So I became founder, artistic director, and John became managing director, and we did that until you and Megan came along.
Right. So in these early years of TSF, John Dodd, obviously a major influence on the festival and what was possible. Who were the other people that especially in the early years, really guided the organization and shaped it?
At the very beginning, Jose Cantu, who was my former student that taught at SMU, he was instrumental in helping me get this whole thing arranged, organized, and started. And I can't leave out Kilgore College. Dr. McLaurin, who was the president, had faith in the festival, agreed to fund it for 2 years instead of 1, gave me pretty much free rein to do what I wanted to do without asking questions, and they never interfered. And he was followed by other presidents who were the same. And so the support from the college has been, without doubt, the major reason why we're still here.
Yeah.
They let us use these buildings. We've used 7 buildings every summer for many years. They provide us the use of these buildings free of charge. We don't pay any rent. We don't pay any utilities. We don't pay any insurance. So those in-kind contributions, we couldn't live without. So the college is certainly the main supporter. But there are other people too that I hired in. One of the major ones was Eve Adamson, who...
A famous name for
Yes.
TSF, yeah.
Yes, and people in theater would probably recognize her name.
Yeah.
She lived in New York City. She founded the Jean Cocteau Repertory Theater in down near the Bowery, and was running it for years. She was a very good friend of Tennessee Williams. And I was up there holding auditions, so I asked to meet her, and thinking there was no hope, I said, Eve, would you ever be interested in coming down to Texas to direct for the Texas Shakespeare Festival? Because she was only interested in classical theater. She wouldn't do anything else. She jumped at the chance, and she came, and we kept her here for 9 consecutive years. She was a taskmaster. She was gruff. She was a perfectionist, and that's just exactly what we needed at that time. But I think of her as being a real founding artist. Another is Paul Reinhardt, Dr. Paul Reinhardt, and was well known. He was probably the best known costume design teacher in the country. And he came up here one summer, and of the summer of 88, I think, or 87. He and Dr. Brock wrote the Bible of theater history and was a teacher at University of Texas. They were good friends. They drove up here together to see all 3 shows of that 87 season. And he called me the following evening and said, would I please have breakfast with them the next morning? And I thought, well, certainly, I'll be honored. And we did. Very cordial, friendly. He was very complimentary. He said something like, this festival reminds me of the early days of the Pacific Conservatory for the Performing Arts, which is in California, and that he was a member of many years ago, and where he met his wife, I think. And that was a compliment to me, because I had been to the productions of PCPA and was envious. So the conversation sort of lagged for a minute, and we drank coffee more, and finally he said, well, do you want me to come and work here with you or not? Sir? He said, I'm willing to come work here. I think I like the atmosphere. I like the feeling of the community. I like what you're doing. I'd be happy to come work here. Well, once again, I was blown away. He came. Brock would come every summer and see the shows. And he became what I called the principal designer for the festival. He not only designed costumes, he brought some of his graduate students with him to help, but he also kept an eye on scenery, lighting, had a general aesthetic, an overall aesthetic that the festival needed, and encouraged me to write a philosophy, a purpose statement for the festival that would be published, which I'd never thought of doing. And I did, and he liked that. And he came back for 10 years until he became ill and moved away.
Why do you think the festival saw such success and was able to grow the way it did?
You know, people ask me that, and I don't know that I know.
Yeah.
I suppose the fact that we were doing that local history play in the first 7 years got their interest. It wasn't Shakespeare, for sure. Even though they bought tickets for it, they wanted to see the local history play. But after 9 years of doing a local history play, we started getting funding from grants and things, that sort of. And the college seemed to be happy that we were still here. And the audience for Shakespeare was growing. And then we started adding plays that weren't Shakespeare and weren't local history plays. We did musicals, we did Molière comedies, we did Shaw, we did The Glass Menagerie, we did Miracle Worker, things that were more accessible to people who might be hesitant to go see a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
And that caught on. So they began to become season patrons and buy season tickets a year ahead of time.
So even though there's a lot of success and growth going on in these middle years of the festival, there's a challenging stretch when there was a production of Angels in America produced at Kilgore College. There's been a lot written about that time, so if people are interested, there's no shortage of information on it, but is there anything that you want to say about that time?
Well, for years I couldn't talk about it because it was such a traumatic year. But let me say to start that it had nothing to do with the festival. I was searching for a play to do as the first play of the fall in 1999 with my students. I thought, I've told them in theater history classes all these years that theater has the power to change lives, that theater can cause riots in the street. There are historical incidents recorded. So in trying to enforce, that lesson, I thought, I'm missing the mark. I haven't done anything that's contemporary to them. So I began reading contemporary plays and had heard about Angels in America, knew that it was controversial, but thought, well, I'll read it anyway. So that summer I read many plays, dozens. And that one stuck in my head and I threw it aside. As soon as I read it, I thought, oh, I can't do that. The language is really, really rough and some of the scenes are, you can't do that on this stage. The theme itself, the fact that it's a story of gay men and their struggles with life, I thought, there's no way I'm going to do that play at Kilgore. So I tried to forget it. Nevertheless, to make a long story short, I did it, knowing that it was going to be a problem. For the first time ever, I didn't require theater students to audition. I had them read the play, and if they didn't want to participate, they didn't have to audition. And even at the readings for the auditions, after they got up and read part of it aloud, if they were uncomfortable, they could walk out, and they did, some of them. But I went ahead and did it anyway, and we were going along just fine, and the cast was very strong. I had a very good group of students at that time, until the college newspaper decided to write an article about the play, and that banner headline was "Gay Play, a Gay Fantasia," above everything else. And I thought, oh no. Because the play is really not about that, Matthew. It's certainly not promoting an alternative lifestyle. It's showing the misery and the suffering of these people during the AIDS crisis and the deaf ears who were not paying attention, including Reagan. So it was mostly a political play and powerfully written. I'd never read anything since Death of a Salesman that I thought was so well written. Every scene is a complete play within itself. Well, as soon as the paper came out, There are people who subscribe to it who are not students. Phone calls started. Letters started coming. So many that Kilgore College had to install a separate telephone line because everybody was complaining. The preachers were preaching sermons against me, against the play. I was invited to move to, I think they said, why didn't I move to San Francisco where I would be more welcome? I got death threats in the mail, then on the phone. It was horrible. The Longview newspaper stopped printing letters to the editor because it was taking up pages of their paper, and they were all negative, of course, except for very few. Every magazine, major magazine, news magazine contacted me. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and phone calls and from everywhere. I was not accustomed to any of that. I didn't know how to handle it. And it really got to me. I found myself trying to defend myself, my personality, my philosophy of teaching, my belief in theater. It was a nightmare. And the college set up a special meeting, and they called me over to the administrative building, and I went in, and there were all these policemen and firemen, and all the administrators were there, and they had a whiteboard with a marker, and they had drawn off the campus, and it's a blur to me now, but they had made plans for securing the building. They invited policemen from Longview to come in. They surrounded the building with policemen. They set up metal detectors outside and inside. I was told that the students had to be locked in the dressing rooms at a certain time each night. I had to stand back at the back with a headset on, and in case anything happened inside the theater, they thought someone would create a disturbance. I was to shout, "Hold," and all the students were to run downstairs. So we did it, although the Board of Trustees at that time, part of the college, demanded that the president of the board call a special meeting so they could vote to cancel the play before we opened. And he wouldn't do it. And they tried to get Bill Holda to do it, and he couldn't do it. And Bill took my side, artistic freedom, freedom of speech. And the permission to educate on things that are controversial, which is what colleges ought to be doing, for heaven's sake. So it looked like we would be canceled. And then I got a call in my office from the People for the American Way and one from the ACLU, both in Washington and New York. And they said, "We hear you're having some trouble down there." And I said, "Well, it looks like it." "Well, are they really trying to shut the theater?" I said, "Yes, it looks like they want to do that." They said, "Don't worry about it. We've already filed an injunction that will keep the theater open until after the play is over. There's no way they can combat the injunction in time to close the theater down." And meanwhile, with Bill Holda's support in trying to keep people from withdrawing their pledges to the college, they were in a capital campaign at the time. We managed to open the play. We did 4 performances rather than our normal 5 or 6. And I was very scared. Came to the theater that night, and there were police everywhere, and there were protesters, picketers outside. There was a big bus painted black that said Kilgore Sodomites. It was terrible. There was a man in town who, in an attempt to limit our audience, bought most of the tickets for the opening night. Bought them all, just almost all of them. And I didn't know about it until 2 or 3 days before we opened. And it made me so mad that I put out a notice that any seat that was not claimed, any ticket that was not claimed, 10 minutes before curtain, I would resell. There was a line of people going out the front, down the sidewalk, and all the way down the side So until they disappeared, waiting to buy tickets to get in, and they had to go through a metal detector to buy the ticket, and then go through another one when they got inside. And they were filming the audience with a video camera and the lobby. So we were late getting started, and I was standing in my office looking out the window, and I saw that line of people. Yeah, I was overcome. So they finally were all admitted and took their seats, and I came in that door just to apologize to the audience and to thank them for being patient. And it was packed. And as soon as I came through that door, they all jumped to their feet and started cheering and applauding. And they did that at the end of the show, and they did it every single night at the beginning.
How did it impact you as a theater maker and as a leader?
First, I don't think I would ever have done it had I not attended Linklater workshop and gone through that EST-like training. But I doubted myself many times. Am I being selfish? Is this going to hurt my wife and child? And it did. They suffered through that. And I'm very sorry for that. But I don't regret it at all. Would I do it again? No, not here. No, not here. Would I do it again somewhere else? Absolutely. I just believe in the power of theater that much. And when you find that rare play that illustrates the power of art, the life-changing power of art, you have to do it. You don't have a choice. We can't be doing Betty Burp's The Baby every year, or even some silly other comedy that's well known. You can't do Our Town, great as it is, every year. Life is more complicated than that, and much more rich and fulfilling.
Switching gears.
Okay.
When did the connection with China start? How did that all come about?
A former student of mine who had worked at the festival as well moved to China and became the artistic director and the founder of the World Institute of Theater and Film at Beijing University, which is sometimes called Peking University. And he's working there, still does. And he invited us to bring one of our productions of the festival over there to China after we closed here in August of 2005. And I directed the play. It was The Miracle Worker, which had never been done in China. Because of that, Joe Graves, the man who was my student, 3 years later, talked to a man at Hong Kong University of Hong Kong, because they did a Shakespeare festival every summer in which all the universities who wanted to participate in China could submit a 20-minute version of a Shakespeare play, and they were adjudicated and narrowed down to 12, and those 12 were invited, all expenses paid, to Hong Kong to perform. And I was invited to be one of the 3 international judges for that Shakespeare festival. The other two, one was from Oxford and one was from a university in Australia. So I went over in 2008 to judge the Chinese University Shakespeare Festival. There were 12 entries. The one that we voted to place in 5th place was from Sichuan University. I've forgotten the full title. And it was a 3-person cast of Hamlet. And it was Steve Zhang, and Angelina had been producing it, and Joyce Hu was also in it. And I thought it was so charming because they had used puppets for the play within a play. And they didn't win because a lot of it depended on how well they could speak English. But I was so taken by their creativity that in the judging room, when we were making our decisions, I lobbied for them to get a special award just for their creativity. And the other 2 judges agreed. So as soon as the contest was over, Angelina and Steve, 2 of the people in the play who had written the script, came running into the hallway to introduce themselves. And that was very charming. they wanted to know me. They wanted to know about Texas Shakespeare. They said, "Can we come visit?" And I said, "Yes, you may come visit, but not this year because it's too late." They got busy and they worked on it. And she brought like 6 or 8 people with her. They did the next summer. They came over and they did a little production of that Hamlet that I had seen. And the only people in the audience were our company members, and they wept.
That was my first year. I
Some of them were-
remember that night vividly.
Okay. Then you know some of them were moved by that performance. And they wanted to come back. And so they've been coming back every year for 11 years. And then because of the virus, they weren't able to come this year. But now they have their own theater. They're married now and have a baby. That's how the association with the Chinese came about.
So, beginning to wrap up here,
Okay.
going through this whole journey, how have you changed as an artist? I guess how have you changed as a man? How have you changed as a theater maker, which has been your profession throughout this journey?
I think I take it a lot more seriously than I ever thought possible. I discovered very quickly when I started teaching theater, especially at the college level, university level, students came in as freshmen having no clue as to what theater was about. All they knew was, for the most part, some little extracurricular activity you do in high school if you're not an athlete. And it's normally a musical or a comedy.
Right.
It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating when you know plays like Angels in America, Death of a Salesman, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf are out there, and what great resources they are. So it's a constant struggle to open their eyes, to get them to discover that this is serious business. It's not play acting.
Yeah.
It's not making believe, although it is. It's vital to your life, to your soul, to mine. So much so that I sometimes wonder if I'm actually living or playing a role, you know. Nevertheless, it is who I am, and you finally have to give in to that I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not many, 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 many things. Most things I'm not. 1 or 2 things I am. And one of those is a lover of the arts, particularly language arts, poems, poetry, plays, and a great admirer to the point of being jealous of actors because they're the bravest people in the world. I don't say that lightly. It's the truth. It's just that people don't know it. They put their souls on the line. A serious actor is not acting. He's filling some void inside himself with those roles he's playing. He's giving himself totally to the approval of an audience. He's putting everything on the line to the point where it could be very embarrassing. Acting is not putting on anything, it's taking off. It's removing those layers to expose yourself. All art does that, really. Poems do that for sure. And nothing strikes me harder than poems, just the right ones, or lines from a play. I am moved every day just from the storehouse of memories of words, phrases, just the human spirit. It's what it's all about.
Yeah.
My mother thought I would be a preacher. She hoped I would be a preacher.
But your mother said something very moving towards the end of her life about your profession.
My mom was dying on the hospital bed long before she actually died. I went to visit her and she was asleep. So rather than wake her up, I just looked at her hands, as arthritic and old as they were. She was 95 and a half. And she had meant so much to me, of course, all my life. I just touched her hand rather than wake her up. But when I did, it woke her up. And she opened her eyes and gripped my hand and kind of pulled on me. So I leaned down and she whispered one word at a time. She said, "I love what you do." How could I do anything else?